60 years of love, a lifetime of secrets, and one box that could unravel it all. In 2015, Jimmy Carter finds something his wife Ellie hid until her dying breath. A photograph, a cryptic note from 2010. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper." Who was she hiding? A son she lost decades ago, a past she ran from with Jimmy in 55, defying a world that wanted them apart? And why, after confessing once in 85, did she bury it again when he came looking? Every letter holds a clue, every silence a cost. And what Jimmy uncovers will change everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved. Love built on ashes isn't clean. It's messy, it's real, and it's waiting to be found. Stick with us through this 6-part journey of guilt, forgiveness, and a family pieced together from the wreckage. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth. Subscribe so you don't miss a single twist, and drop a comment. What would you do if the past came knocking after 60 years? Let's dig in. The rain came down hard that night, a relentless drumbeat against the sagging roof of the little 2-story house on the edge of Chicago. It was March 2015, a cold, gray stretch of days that seemed to stretch time itself into something heavy and unyielding. Inside, the air was thick with silence, the kind that presses into your bones, the kind that lingers after someone's gone and left a hole too big to name. James "Jimmy" Carter sat at the kitchen table, alone, his gnarled hands stained with decades of grease and steel mill soot, curled around a chipped mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. At 82, he was a man carved from hard years, tall and lean, his skin a deep, weathered brown, his eyes sharp as ever, but clouded now with something new. Grief, sure, but something else too. Regret. Across from him, the empty chair stared back like a ghost. Ellie's chair. Eleanor Harper, his wife of 60 years, had sat there every morning, her silver hair catching the light as she sipped tea and hummed old jazz tunes she'd picked up God knows where. She'd been gone a week now, taken by a heart too tired to keep beating, and the house felt wrong without her. Too quiet, too still. The rain pounded harder, as if trying to drown out the ache in his chest, but it couldn't touch the guilt clawing at him. I should have done something back then. Why didn't I? It started with the box. He'd found it that afternoon, tucked under their bed like a secret she'd buried in the shadows. He'd been looking for her old scarf, the blue one she loved, the one he wanted to keep close now that she was gone, when his fingers brushed against something hard, a wooden box, no bigger than a cigar case, its edges worn smooth by time. He'd pulled it out, heart thudding, and sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at it like it might bite. Ellie had shown it to him once, decades ago, after that day in 85, when everything changed. She'd confessed then, about the boy, about Michael, but they'd agreed to let it lie, to keep it from the kids, to move on. He'd thought it was behind them. Now with her gone, it felt like a promise he'd failed to keep. The hinges creaked as he opened it, and the smell hit him first. Old paper, faint lavender, a whisper of her. Inside there were letters, a handful of them, yellowed and brittle, tied with a faded ribbon. Next to them, a photograph, edges curled, of a little boy, maybe 5 years old, standing stiffly in a cheap suit, his sharp blue eyes wide and searching. Jimmy's breath caught. He knew that face, even if he'd only seen it once, years back. And then, slipped between the letters, a newer note, dated 2010, in a rough, unfamiliar hand. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough." Below it, in Ellie's shaky scrawl, "Jimmy, he found me again." I couldn't face him. "I'm sorry." The mug slipped in his hands, coffee sloshing onto the table. He didn't notice. His eyes locked on that note, those words sinking into him like a blade. He found her again? The question burned, sharp and urgent, because he'd thought they'd buried this. Back in the 80s, when she'd broken down and told him about the son she'd lost, the one her father had taken away. They decided it was too late, too messy to dig it up. But this note from 5 years ago said different. Michael had come looking, and Ellie had kept it quiet again, even from him. The rain outside felt like it was washing away the years he'd spent believing they'd move past it, leaving nothing but a man haunted by what he hadn't done. He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes, and let the sound of the storm pull him back. Back to 1955, to a dusty little town in Alabama, where the air smelled of gasoline and fear, where a black man like him learned early to keep his head down and his dreams smaller than the white folks' shadows. Back to the night he met her, Eleanor Harper, the girl with fire in her eyes and a smile that could unravel a man's whole world. The night that changed everything. It was a basement joint hidden beneath a rundown barber shop, the kind of place where the rules didn't reach. Jazz spilled out of a beat-up saxophone, smooth and defiant, curling around the edges of a world split clean in two by color. Jimmy was 20 then, a mechanic with oil under his nails and a quiet hunger in his chest. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not with white folks mixing in, not with the unspoken laws that said a black man caught in the wrong crowd could end up swinging from a tree. But the music called him, and he'd slipped in, leaning against the wall, letting the rhythm drown out the weight of the day. That's when he saw her. She walked in like she owned the place, a red dress hugging her frame, blonde hair tumbling over her shoulders like a cascade of sunlight. Eleanor Harper wasn't just beautiful. She was electric, a live wire in a room full of shadows. She didn't flinch when her blue eyes met his, didn't turn away like the other white girls he'd been warned about. Instead, she crossed the room, her heels clicking against the concrete, and stopped right in front of him. "I'm Ellie," she said, voice low and steady, like she was daring him to look away. "What's your name?" He froze. A white girl talking to him like that, close enough he could smell her perfume, jasmine and rebellion, was trouble he didn't need. But there was no fear in her, no hesitation, just a spark in her eyes that hit him like a punch. "Jimmy," he managed, his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "Jimmy Carter." She smiled, slow and dangerous, and it was like the room tilted. "Jimmy Carter," she repeated, tasting the name. "You don't look like you belong here." "Neither do you," he shot back before he could stop himself. Her laugh was soft but real, cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke. "Maybe that's why I like it." They talked that night, hours slipping by like minutes, about nothing and everything. She asked about the engines he fixed, the way they hummed under his hands like living things. He asked why a girl like her, all silk and privilege, was sneaking into a place like this. She said she hated the life her father had mapped out for her. Henry Caldwell, a big-shot businessman who'd sooner burn the world down than see his daughter step out of line. Jimmy listened, wary but hooked, because there was something in her voice, something restless, something true, that mirrored the ache he'd carried his whole life. When the music faded and the crowd thinned, she leaned close, her breath warm against his ear. "I want to see you again, Jimmy Carter. Don't make me come looking for you." He should have said no, should have walked away and let her fade into the night, a memory he could bury deep. But he didn't, and that was the beginning, or maybe the end, of everything he thought he knew. Back in the kitchen, the rain slowed to a drizzle, tapping out a rhythm that matched the thud of his heart. Jimmy opened his eyes, the box still open in front of him, the 2010 note trembling in his hand. 60 years. They'd built a life together. Kids, a home, a love he'd staked his soul on. He'd known about Michael since the 80s, when she'd broken down after seeing him at the market, but they'd let it go, thinking time would heal it. Now this note said time had run out. Michael had found her again, and she'd faced it alone. Why hadn't she told him this time? And why hadn't he pushed harder back then? He set the note down, fingers brushing the photograph of the boy. Those eyes, wide, searching, felt like they were staring right through him, asking questions he'd dodged for too long. He'd almost shoved the box back under the bed in '85, let her secret stay buried, but now it was different. Ellie was gone, and Michael was still out there, waiting. Jimmy took a shaky breath, resolve settling in. He'd start with the letters, because somewhere in those faded lines, Ellie was still reaching for him, and he owed them both to finish what they'd left undone. Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the window, faint and fragile. The rain had softened, but the silence in the house grew louder, alive with the weight of what he'd uncovered. Jimmy sat there, the photograph in one hand, the letters waiting, knowing this was his chance to make it right. Whatever Ellie had hidden, whatever he'd let slide, he'd face it now. Not just for her, but for the man he'd been with her all those years. Because love wasn't just holding on, it was stepping up when the past came knocking. The kitchen was still dark when Jimmy unfolded the first letter, the paper crackling like dry leaves under his fingers. Dawn hadn't fully broken yet, just a thin smear of gray light sneaking through the curtains. But he couldn't wait any longer. The weight of Ellie's 2010 note, "Jimmy, he found me again. I'm sorry," sat heavy in his chest, a ghost he thought they'd laid to rest decades ago. 60 years of marriage, and here he was, picking at a wound they'd bandaged back in the 80s, after she'd seen Michael at the market and spilled it all. They'd agreed then to let it go, to keep it from Samuel and Abigail, to move forward. Now with her gone, that choice felt like a failure he couldn't outrun. He smoothed the letter out on the table, his eyes tracing the faded ink. It wasn't dated, but the handwriting was hers, younger, steadier from a time before everything changed. "Jimmy," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I never meant to keep it from you forever, but some things are too big to say out loud. I thought I could bury it, leave it behind like the life I ran from. He was born before I met you, a piece of me I lost. I thought running would fix it, but it's followed me." The words stopped there, jagged and incomplete, like she'd lost her nerve halfway through. Jimmy's throat tightened. Michael. She'd told him the name back in '85, tears streaming down her face. But this letter, written earlier, maybe right after they'd settled in Illinois, showed how long she'd carried it alone before that confession. Why hadn't she trusted him sooner? And why, after all these years, had she hidden Michael's return in 2010? He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let his mind drift back to that first leap, the night they'd run. Alabama, 1955. The memory came sharp and fast, like a reel of film flickering to life. He could still feel the heat of that summer, thick and sticky, clinging to his skin, as he waited for her at the edge of town. The abandoned train station was a skeleton of rusted beams and broken glass, the kind of place folks didn't linger after dark. Jimmy stood there, heart hammering, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder with nothing in it but a change of clothes and a wrench he couldn't bear to leave behind. He'd told himself this was crazy, a black man running off with a white girl, Henry Caldwell's daughter no less. If they got caught, there'd be no talking their way out of it, no mercy, just blood and rope. But then she appeared, a shadow slipping out of the night, her red dress swapped for a plain gray skirt and a blouse buttoned up tight. Ellie carried a small suitcase, her knuckles white around the handle, her blue eyes wide with something between fear and fire. "You sure about this?" he'd asked, voice low, searching her face for any crack of doubt. She'd swallowed hard, glanced back at the empty road, then nodded. "I'm sure, Jimmy. Let's go." The freight train roared, and 10 minutes later, a beast of steel and smoke bound for Illinois. They climbed aboard, hiding between crates of grain, the rumble of the wheels drowning out the world they were leaving behind. Jimmy remembered the way she'd pressed close to him, her body trembling against his as the train lurched north. He'd wrapped an arm around her, steadying her, and for a moment it felt like they could outrun anything. Her father's rage, the laws that branded their love a crime, the whole damn South with its clenched fists and bared teeth. But even then, in the dark of that cattle car, he'd caught a flicker in her eyes. Something distant, something she wasn't telling him. He'd chalked it up to nerves. Now, with this letter in his hands, he knew it was more. Michael, already a shadow in her heart, born a year before she'd walked into that basement. Back in the kitchen, Jimmy set the first letter aside and reached for the next. This one wasn't from Ellie. The handwriting was blocky, unfamiliar, scratched out in black ink that had bled through the page. "You don't understand what you've done," it read. No signature, no date, just a cold, blunt warning. His gut twisted. Henry Caldwell. It had to be. Ellie's father had tracked them down before, letters showing up at their boarding house in Illinois. each one sharper than the last. "Come home. You're ruining yourself. You'll regret this." Back then, Henry's words had been a fist in the dark, a threat that kept Jimmy awake, listening for footsteps outside their door. Now they felt like a ghost rattling the frame, a reminder of the life she'd fled, and the son she'd left behind under his orders. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise, one Henry had kept by tearing Michael away. Jimmy had watched her burn those early letters, her hands steady as she fed the flames, but he'd never forgotten the way her shoulders tensed every time the mail came. Henry hadn't just been a father. He'd been a jailer, a man who'd locked Ellie in a cage of silk and expectation until she clawed her way out with him. He rubbed his eyes, the ache of memory settling into his bones. That first year in Illinois had tested them both. The factory town was a sprawl of soot and steel, a far cry from the green hills of Alabama. Jimmy took a job at the mill, 12-hour shifts in heat so brutal it melted the air in your lungs. Ellie stitched dresses in a cramped sweatshop, her fingers blistered and raw by the end of each day. They'd rented a room in a boarding house, walls thin as paper, a bed barely big enough for two, but it was theirs. No one cared about a mixed couple here, not out of kindness, but out of exhaustion. Indifference was its own kind of freedom. They'd married in a hurry, a quick ceremony in a clapboard church on the edge of town. No guests, no rings, just a preacher with tired eyes who muttered the vows like he'd rather be anywhere else. Ellie had stood outside afterward, staring up at the sky, her blonde hair catching the wind. "We did it, Jimmy," she'd said, voice soft but fierce. "We're free." He'd believed her then, believed the past was behind them. Michael, too, once she'd told him in '85. But now, with the 2010 note beside these old letters, he saw the truth. Freedom had come with a cost she'd never fully paid, and he'd let her carry it alone. The third piece of paper was the one he'd found first. The 2010 note, torn and creased, the edges ragged like it had been clutched too long. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough," it said, the words scrawled in a rough, angry hand. Below it, Ellie's shaky addition. "Jimmy, he found me again. I'm sorry." His pulse kicked up. This wasn't Henry. This was Michael, reaching out decades later, long after that '85 glimpse. How had he found her this time? And why had she kept it quiet, even after they'd faced it together once before? The thought snagged in his mind, a thread he couldn't pull loose. He stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and paced the small kitchen. The boy in the photograph, those wide, searching eyes flashed in his mind. Michael had been out there all along, a shadow they'd tried to bury in the '80s, only for him to resurface when Ellie was too frail to fight it. Jimmy's hands clenched into fists, not from anger, but from the raw, gnawing guilt of letting it slide back then. He'd loved her. God, he'd loved her, with every piece of himself, through every hard day and quiet night. Hadn't that earned him a say in this too? The clock on the wall ticked past 5 a.m., the silence of the house pressing in again. He sank back into the chair, staring at the mess of papers and the photograph. Michael had been a piece of her they'd locked away, a choice they'd made together, or so he'd thought. Now, with her gone and that 2010 note staring back, Jimmy was left to face it alone. He picked up the picture, tracing the boy's face with a trembling finger. "Why didn't we look for you?" he whispered, voice rough in the empty room. "What did she owe you that we couldn't give?" Outside, the drizzle picked up again, a soft patter against the window. It reminded him of that train ride, the way the rain had streaked the cracks in the boxcar, the way Ellie had leaned into him like he was her anchor. They'd made it through that night, through the years that followed, through kids and bills and a world that never quite let them forget who they were. But this was a storm they dodged, not weathered, and it had come back for them. He gathered the letters, stacking them beside the box, and made a decision. He'd keep going, through every word, every clue, until he found the answers they'd run from together. Because if 60 years with her had taught him anything, it was that love wasn't just holding on. It was owning up, even when the ground gave way beneath you. The rain had settled into a steady hum by mid-morning, a gray curtain draping the world outside Jimmy's kitchen window. He stood there, hands braced against the sink, staring at the blur of rooftops and smokestacks that had been his view for decades. The letters on the table behind him felt alive, whispering Ellie's voice into the silence. He was born before I met you. It's followed me. And beside them, the 2010 note that had shaken him awake. I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough. Her scrawl below it. Jimmy, he found me again, cut deeper than the rest. They'd faced this once, back in '85, when she'd seen Michael at the market and confessed. A son she'd lost at 17, taken by her father's hand. They'd chosen to let it lie then, to shield Samuel and Abigail, to keep their life intact. Now, knowing Michael had come back 5 years ago, Jimmy couldn't shake the guilt of staying silent when he should have acted. He turned back, the photograph of the boy catching the light, sharp blue eyes like Ellie's, wide and searching, set in a face that echoed Samuel's but carried a hardness he didn't recognize. How old would he be now? 57, born in '54, a year before they'd met, a grown man out there somewhere, reaching for her again. Jimmy sank into the chair, pulling the next letter from the pile with hands that wouldn't steady. This one was from her, dated 1958, the year Samuel came. His breath hitched as he opened it, the paper trembling in his grip. Jimmy, it read, I want to tell you everything, but I can't. Not yet. I look at our boy and I see him, see what I lost. I thought running would fix it, but it's still here, eating at me. Forgive me. The ink smeared at the end, like she'd cried over it before folding it away. Jimmy's breath caught, a child before me. She'd carried that weight alone back then, before she'd broken down in '85 and told him about Michael, about the summer fling, the baby her father had ripped away, the guilt that never left. He'd held her then, promised they'd move past it, but now with this letter from '58, he saw how long it had gnawed at her before she'd let him in. And even after they'd buried it, together he'd thought, until that 2010 note proved otherwise. The thought sank like lead, heavy with years he'd let slide. He'd built his world around her, every late night at the mill, every dollar stretched thin, every laugh shared in the dark, and they'd agreed to leave Michael behind. Now that choice felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of her, of the boy they'd ignored. Samuel, steady as ever in Ohio with his wife and kids, Abigail chasing sunsets in California, wild and free. Did they carry her shadow too, without even knowing it? He closed his eyes and the past rushed in again, sharp and unbidden. Illinois, 1956, the first year of their new life. They'd landed in that factory town with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stubborn kind of hope. Jimmy found work fast, hauling steel beams in a mill where the air burned your throat and the noise rattled your skull. $12 a week, barely enough to scrape by, but he didn't care. It was honest, and it kept them fed. Ellie took to sewing, her delicate hands learning the rhythm of needle and thread in a sweatshop down the street. She'd come home each night with red-rimmed eyes and calluses blooming across her fingertips, but she'd smile at him, a tired, determined smile that said they were in this together. Their room in the boarding house was a shoebox, peeling paint, a sagging mattress, a single bulb flickering overhead. The first night they'd lain there, side by side, listening to the couple next door argue through the thin walls. Jimmy had turned to her, tracing the curve of her cheek in the dim light. This ain't much, he'd said, voice low, but it's ours. She'd nodded, her hand finding his. It's enough, Jimmy, long as we've got each other. He'd believed her. God help him. He'd believed every word. They'd married a month later, a quick vow in that rundown church, and for a while, it felt like they'd beaten the odds. The town didn't love them. Folks at the mill kept their distance, and the women at the market eyed Ellie like she'd lost her mind, but no one bothered them outright. Indifference was a shield, and they wore it like armor, but the cracks started small. He saw it first in the way she'd sit by the window some nights, staring out at the smokestacks like they held answers she couldn't find. She'd go quiet, too quiet, her hands idle in her lap, her mind somewhere he couldn't reach. You okay, Ellie? He'd ask, and she'd snap out of it, flashing that smile again. Just tired, she'd say. Long day. He didn't push. Jimmy wasn't the prying type. He'd grown up knowing some wounds were better left alone. But now, with that 58 letter in his hands, he cursed himself for not seeing it sooner. Michael, already a ghost in her eyes even then. The real shift came with Samuel. Their first boy was born in 58, a squalling bundle of life that turned their world upside down. Jimmy remembered the day clear as glass, Ellie in the boarding house bed, sweat-soaked and beaming, cradling the baby like he was a miracle. Samuel had his father's rich brown skin and his mother's sharp, curious eyes, a perfect mix of them both. Jimmy had held him, heart swelling, and thought, this is it. This is what we fought for. A family, a future. But Ellie, something changed in her after that. She loved Samuel, no question, doted on him, sang to him, stitched him little shirts from scraps. Yet there were moments when Jimmy caught her staring at the boy, her face tight with something he couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or regret. One night he'd found her by the crib, tears streaking her cheeks, her breath hitching like she was choking on something. "Ellie, what's wrong?" he'd asked, rushing to her side. She'd wiped her face quick, turning away. "Nothing, Jimmy, just overwhelmed. He's so beautiful, you know?" He'd pulled her close, her head resting against his chest, and let it go. Back then, he'd thought it was new mother nerves. It wasn't until 85, when she'd told him about Michael, that he'd understood. Every look at Samuel had been a mirror to the son she'd lost. And even after they'd faced it, they'd let it fade, thinking silence would heal it. Now with that 2010 note, he knew it never had. Back in the kitchen, Jimmy opened his eyes, the sink dripping slow and steady into the quiet. He turned back to the table, the photograph's blue eyes piercing him again. Michael, her first boy, her secret until 85, her burden they'd both shouldered and then set aside. The guilt twisted deeper. They'd built a family, raised Samuel and Abigail, while Michael had grown up somewhere else, alone. And in 2010, he'd found her again. How, Jimmy didn't know yet, and she'd kept it from him, maybe out of fear, maybe shame. He sank into the chair, the weight of their choice pressing down. How could they have let him go unanswered, not once, but twice? The clock ticked past 7 a.m., the gray light outside thickening into day. Jimmy's mind raced, stitching the fragments into a jagged truth. Michael had been out there all along, a shadow they'd tried to bury in 85, only for him to resurface when Ellie was too frail to face him. The pain wasn't in her first silence. It was in the years after, when they'd chosen to do nothing, and in 2010, when she'd chosen it again. He stood, pacing to the window, the drizzle blurring the world beyond. He thought of Samuel, grown now, a quiet strength in Ohio, father to 2 boys of his own. Abigail, their wild girl, off in California, chasing dreams with a laugh that could light up a room. They didn't know any of this, didn't see the cracks their mother had hidden and that he'd helped her hide. But now with Ellie gone, he couldn't let it rest. Michael deserved answers, and so did they all. The rain picked up, a steady drum against the glass, echoing the night they'd run, the night he'd thought they'd left the past behind, but it'd been there all along, lurking in her silences, her tears, their decisions. Jimmy turned back to the table, resolve hardening in his chest. He'd read every letter, chased every thread, until he found Michael, not just for Ellie, but for the family they'd built, and the one they'd left behind. Because love, real love, didn't stop at burying the past. It meant facing it, even when it broke you all over again. The rain had settled into a steady hum by mid-morning, a gray curtain draping the world outside Jimmy's kitchen window. He stood there, hands braced against the sink, staring at the blur of rooftops and smokestacks that had been his view for decades. The letters on the table behind him felt alive, whispering Ellie's voice into the silence. "I look at our boy, and I see him. Forgive me." And beside them, the 2010 note that had torn open a wound they'd patched in 85. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough." Her shaky addition. "Jimmy, he found me again. I'm sorry." Hit harder every time he read it. They'd faced Michael once, 30 years ago, when she'd seen him at the market, a chance glimpse of the son her father had taken, a truth she'd finally shared. They'd chosen to let it lie then, to keep their family whole. Now, knowing he'd come back in 2010, Jimmy couldn't shake the guilt of doing nothing. Twice, he turned back, the photograph of the boy catching the light. Sharp blue eyes like Ellie's, wide and searching. Michael. How old would he be now? 57, a man who'd grown up without them while they'd raised Samuel and Abigail. Jimmy sank into the chair, pulling the next letter from the pile with hands that wouldn't steady. This one was from her, dated 1985. The year she'd broken down and told him. His breath hitched as he opened it, the paper trembling in his grip. Jimmy, it read, I saw him today. Not in Samuel's face this time. He was real, across the street at the market. I'd know those eyes anywhere. He didn't come closer, didn't say a word, just watched me. I wanted to run to him, to say I'm sorry, but I couldn't move. What would I tell him? That I let my father take him because I was too young, too scared. That I've lived with it every day? I had to tell you this time. I can't carry it alone anymore. But we can't dig it up, not now. The kids. I love you, Jimmy. I hope that's enough. The letter slipped from his fingers, floating to the table like a dead leaf. 1985. He remembered that year. Samuel off at college, Abigail tearing through high school like a tornado, and Ellie quieter than ever, her silences stretching long and heavy. She'd come home from the market that day, pale as a ghost, and that night she'd told him everything. Michael, born in '54, given up under Henry's iron fist, a shadow she'd seen in their son every day. Jimmy had held her as she cried, promised they'd keep it between them, that Samuel and Abigail didn't need to know. They'd moved on, or so he'd thought. But this letter, and that 2010 note, said different. Michael had found her again, years later, and she'd kept it quiet once more. He closed his eyes and the past rushed in, sharp and unbidden. It was 1959, a year after Samuel, when Abigail came. Their wild girl, born screaming into a world that didn't know what to make of her. Jimmy had been at the mill when the news came, racing home through the snow to find Ellie exhausted but glowing, Abigail's tiny fists punching the air. They'd laughed that night, the four of them crammed into that boarding house room, Samuel toddling around, Abigail wailing, Ellie's voice soft as she sang them both to sleep. Jimmy had watched her, heart full, thinking, this is ours. We made this. Back then, he hadn't known about Michael, not until '85. But now, looking back, he saw the shadow in her glow. Every lullaby she'd sung had carried a note of loss he'd missed. He opened his eyes, the kitchen snapping back into focus. That boy, Michael, had been out there all along, a piece of Ellie they'd tried to bury after '85. That market sighting, it hadn't been planned, just a twist of fate, a stranger's face she'd recognized in a crowd. Jimmy's mind raced back to that year, sifting through memories for what he'd ignored. She'd gone to the market every Saturday, bartering for potatoes and milk, the kids trailing behind until they'd grown too old for it. Had Michael been there, watching, not knowing what to say? The image clawed at him. Ellie frozen at the stalls, her hands shaking around a sack of flour, pretending not to see. He reached for the next letter, the one he'd found first from 2010. I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough, it said, the ink rough and angry. Below it, Ellie's scrawl. Jimmy, he found me again. I'm sorry. Jimmy's breath stopped. Michael reaching out again, decades later. How had he tracked her this time? And why had she hidden it, even after '85, when they'd sworn no more secrets? He slammed the letter down, the sound echoing in the empty room. Damn it, Ellie, he muttered, voice breaking. Why didn't you let me help you? The clock ticked past noon, the rain easing into a drizzle that streaked the window like tears. Jimmy stood, pacing again, his mind a storm of questions. That 2010 note, had Michael slipped it under their door himself? She'd been frail by then, her heart failing, but she'd still walk to the market when she could. Had he stood on their porch, waiting for an answer she couldn't give? The thought of it, of Michael so close, knowing her name while Jimmy stayed in the dark, made his blood run cold. She tried to tell him then, in those last days, her voice breaking on back then. He saw it now, the weight of Michael in her whisper. He'd hushed her, thinking it was just the fever talking, but it'd been this. Michael back again, and her too scared to face him or to burden Jimmy with it. He sank back into the chair, the guilt pressing down. They'd let Michael go in '85, a choice they'd made together. But 2010, she'd carried that alone, and he'd missed it. 60 years, and he'd thought they'd faced everything side by side. Now he knew they hadn't. The memory of her confession in '85 crept in, raw and clear. She'd sat right here at this table, hands trembling around a cup of tea, telling him about Michael, how her father had arranged it, how she'd had no say. "I saw him today, Jimmy," she'd said, voice cracking. "He's real, and I let him go." They'd talked all night, decided the kids were better off not knowing, that digging it up would break too much. Now with that 2010 note, he saw the cost of that silence. Not just for Michael, but for her, for them. Jimmy picked up the photograph, resolve hardening like steel in his gut. "I'll find you," he said, voice low and steady. "For her, for us." Michael had come looking twice, once by chance, once with purpose, and Ellie was gone. Jimmy was all that was left to answer him. He didn't know how Michael had found her in 2010, but he'd figure it out, not just for her, but for the family they'd built, and the one they'd left behind. Outside, the drizzle slowed, the world holding its breath. The house creaked around him, an old companion in this unraveling story. Jimmy gathered the letters, the box, his determination, his map to a past they'd dodged too long. He didn't know where it would lead, but he'd follow it, because love wasn't just the life you built, it was the wreckage you faced when it came calling. The drizzle had faded to a faint mist by afternoon, leaving the kitchen bathed in a dull, silver light that seeped through the window. Jimmy sat hunched over the table, the letters and photographs spread out like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't walk away from. His hands ached from clenching them. His eyes burned from reading Ellie's words over and over. "I saw him today. I had to tell you this time. I hope that's enough." And beside them, the 2010 note that had unraveled everything. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough." Her shaky scrawl below it. "Jimmy, he found me again. I'm sorry." Cut deepest. They'd faced Michael in '85, after that market sighting, when she'd broken down and told him about the son her father had taken. They'd chosen to let it lie, to keep it from the kids, to move on. But 2010, 5 years ago, Michael had come back, and she'd kept it quiet again. The guilt of that silence, theirs and hers, was a weight Jimmy couldn't shake. He stood, the chair scraping the floor, and shuffled to the bedroom. The air there still carried her, lavender and thyme, a scent that clung to the sheets even after she'd gone. He knelt by the bed, reaching for the box again, needing something more, some final piece to make sense of it all. His fingers brushed a loose panel inside, and with a tug, it gave way. A single envelope tumbled out, sealed, yellowed, addressed to him in Ellie's shaky hand. No date, just Jimmy, scrawled across the front. His heart thudded, loud in the quiet. This was it, her last word written after 2010, hidden deeper than the rest. He tore it open, sinking onto the mattress as he read. "Jimmy, my love," it began, "if you're holding this, I'm gone, and you found the rest. I tried to tell you in '85, and I did, about Michael, about what my father did. We let it go then, and I thought that was right. But he found me again, years later, and I couldn't face him. I couldn't face you with it either. Not after we'd buried it. That note in 2010, it came in the mail. I don't know how he tracked me, but he did. I should have told you then, but I was scared, not of him, but of you hating me for dragging it up again, so close to the end. There's more, Jimmy, and it's the hardest part. When I ran to you, it wasn't love, not at first. It was fear. Fear of the life Daddy wanted, the husband he'd picked, the cage I'd never escape. I chose you because you were my way out. But you made it love. You stayed, you fought, you gave me Samuel and Abigail, and a home I didn't deserve. I've loved you true, deeper than I ever thought I could. Forgive me, please. For 85, for 2010, for everything. I hope it's enough." The letter fell to his lap, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't let fall since her funeral. Michael. She'd named him in 85, a boy born in 54, taken by Henry's orders, a wound they'd bandaged together. But 2010, he'd come back through the mail this time, and she'd carried that alone. The bigger blow, though, was the rest. It wasn't love, not at first. 60 years and she'd started with him out of desperation, not desire. He'd been her escape, not her heart. The room spun, the weight of it crushing him. Every morning kiss, every quiet night. They'd felt real, unshakable. Had it all been a lie? He wanted to hate her, to let the hurt win, to tear the letter apart and bury it with her. But her words pulled him back. You made it love. And he couldn't unsee the truth. She hadn't come to him whole, but she'd stayed. She'd built with him. Wasn't that worth something? He stumbled back to the kitchen, the envelope clutched in his hand, and sank into the chair. The photograph stared up at him, Michael's eyes wide and searching, and the ache in his chest turned to something fiercer, something that burned. The past flooded back, clearer than ever. It was 1960, a freezing winter in Illinois. Abigail was a year old, Samuel toddling around their new apartment. A step up from the boarding house, but still cramped and drafty. Jimmy had come home late from the mill, hands numb, body aching, to find Ellie at the stove, stirring a pot of thin soup. She'd looked up, exhaustion in her eyes, but smiled anyway. "Rough day?" she'd asked, voice soft. He'd nodded, too tired to talk, and she'd set a bowl in front of him, her hand brushing his shoulder. She'd glanced at Samuel's crib then, a flicker of something, guilt maybe, crossing her face before she'd masked it. "We're okay, Jimmy," she'd said. "We've got this." He'd missed it then, lost in the warmth of her touch. But now he saw it, Michael, haunting her even in that quiet moment, years before she'd told him. He wiped his face, the tears hot against his skin, and reached into his pocket. His fingers found an old scrap of paper he'd kept there for years. A note he'd written her in 55, crumpled and faded, slipped into her suitcase the night they ran. "Ellie," it said, "I know you don't love me yet. I see it in your eyes. You're scared, and I'm just the one here. But I'll wait. I'll build us something real if you'll let me. I love you enough for both of us." He'd forgotten it, tucked it away like a prayer, but now it hit him like thunder. He'd known. From the start, he'd known she hadn't loved him. Not the way he'd loved her. And he'd stayed anyway. The realization broke him open, but not with pain, with something softer, something fierce. She hadn't lied, not really. She'd been honest in the only way she could, letting him turn her fear into something lasting. First in 55, then again in 85 when they'd faced Michael together. They'd chosen silence then, thinking it protected their family, but 2010, she'd chosen it alone, and he'd let her. The hurt didn't vanish, but it softened, folding into a truth he could hold. She'd loved him, in the end, not because she had to, but because he'd made it real. And they'd failed Michael twice because of it. Jimmy stood, the letter and his note side by side on the table, two halves of their truth. He looked at Michael's photograph, the boy they'd left behind, and felt a shift inside. Ellie was gone, but Michael wasn't. He'd found her in 85 by chance, and again in 2010 with purpose, through the mail somehow, and now it was Jimmy's turn to find him. Not just for her, but for the love they'd forged, flawed and scarred, and for the son they'd owed more to. The mist outside lifted, a sliver of sun breaking through the clouds. Jimmy gathered the letters, the box, his resolve. He didn't know how Michael had tracked her in 2010. Maybe a letter, maybe something new. But he'd start with what he had, her words, their guilt, a chance to make it right. Because love wasn't a fairy tale, clean and bright. It was a house built on ashes, shaky, marked by mistakes, but standing because they'd held it together. And Jimmy Carter wasn't done building yet. He stepped to the door, the air cool against his face, and whispered into the quiet, "I forgive you, Ellie, for 85, for 2010. Now let me fix this." The sun climbed higher, and for the first time since she'd gone, the house didn't feel so empty. The sun hung low in the sky by the time Jimmy stepped out of the house, the box tucked under his arm like a lifeline. The air was crisp, the mist gone, leaving Chicago's streets gleaming with the last traces of rain. He'd spent the afternoon sorting through Ellie's letters one final time. Her words, "Michael, he found me again. You made it love," etched into him now, a map to a past they dodged too long. Forgiveness had settled in his chest, heavy but warm. Forgiveness for her silence in 2010, for their choice in 85, for the years he'd let it lie. With it came a new purpose. Michael was out there, a man born from Ellie's past, and Jimmy was the only one left to find him, not just for her, but for the family they'd built and the one they'd left behind. He started at the kitchen table that night, the 2010 note in hand. "I know who you are, Eleanor Harper. I've waited long enough." Its rough scrawl, a clue to Michael's persistence. Ellie had said it came in the mail, not slipped under the door, a detail that stuck with him. No return address, just a postmark. Chicago, faded but legible. How had Michael tracked her after all those years? Jimmy called Samuel first, his voice crackling over the line from Ohio. "Dad, you okay?" Samuel asked, concern cutting through the static. Jimmy hesitated, then told him. About the box? The 85 confession, the 2010 note, the brother they'd never known. There was a long silence, then Samuel's steady reply. "We should have known. Let's find him. For Mom." Abigail was next, her voice bright and fierce from California. "A brother? Jesus, Dad, you kept this too?" Jimmy heard the hurt in her, the echo of his own guilt, but he softened it with the truth. "We thought we were protecting you, Abby. She was scared, and I let it go. She loved you, more than she could say." Abigail sniffed, then steadied. "Okay, I'm in. Let's track him down." The search wasn't quick. Days turned into weeks, a slow grind of dead ends and half-leads. Samuel dug online, adoption forms, ancestry sites, hoping Michael's 2010 note tied to a DNA match, a trend that had taken off by then. Jimmy called the post office, but the 2010 trail was cold. No records that old. Abigail mailed old photos to Samuel, thinking Michael's face might jog a memory, but nothing clicked. Then a break. Samuel found a 2011 forum post, buried in an adoption group, Michael C., born 54, Alabama, seeking Eleanor Harper, Chicago area. A DNA match from 2009, a half-sister from Henry's side, had led him there. Her name was in an old family letter he tracked down. A construction worker, last active in 2013. It wasn't much, but it was something. Jimmy dialed construction firms in the suburbs, voice hoarse by the 10th call. Most hung up. Wrong Michael, no Michael. But one foreman paused. "Caldwell? Yeah, he worked here. Moved on a couple years back. Try the Union Hall." The Union gave a last known number, disconnected, but a reverse lookup from Samuel pinned an address. A modest house in Cicero, just west of Chicago. Weeks of searching, and it came down to this: a name, a place, a chance. Jimmy called, hands shaking, the line ringing too long before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah? Michael Caldwell?" Jimmy asked, gripping the phone. A pause. "Who's this?" "Jimmy Carter, your mother's husband." The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then Michael's voice came back, low and guarded. "She's gone, isn't she?" "Yeah," Jimmy said, throat tight. "A week ago. She left something for you. Letters, a picture. I'd like you to have them." Another pause, longer this time. "Where are you?" They met 2 days later at a diner off the highway, a rundown spot with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like ash. Jimmy arrived first, the box on the table, his hands folded tight to keep them still. When Michael walked in, Jimmy knew him instantly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with Ellie's sharp blue eyes set in a face weathered by years. He moved slow, deliberate, like he was sizing up the room, and sat across from Jimmy without a word. "You look like her," Jimmy said, breaking the ice. Michael's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Heard that before." He glanced at the box, then back at Jimmy. "Why now?" "After all this." "She told me in '85, Jimmy said, sliding the photograph across. "Saw you at a market, pure chance. We let it go then, thought it was best. Found this after she passed. She said you wrote in 2010. I should have looked sooner." Michael took the picture, fingers tracing the edges, pain flashing in those eyes, raw and unguarded. "I saw her too, '85, he said, voice rough. "Didn't know what to say. Walked away. Took me years to figure it out. DNA test, 2009. Matched a half-sister, found an old letter with her name, tracked her here, sent that note in 10. She never answered." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Why should I care now? 57 years and you're just showing up." Jimmy leaned forward, voice steady. "Because we messed up. She was scared. Scared of losing us. Scared of facing you. I let her carry it alone, '85, 2010. Read this. It's yours." He pushed her last letter across. Michael hesitated, then took it, reading in silence, hands trembling by the end. When he looked up, his eyes were wet, resistance softening. "She loved you," he said, almost a question. "Yeah," Jimmy replied, firm. "And she loved you in her way. Didn't know how to fix it. Neither did I, till now." They sat there, two men bound by a woman they'd lost, the diner humming around them. Michael folded the letter, tucking it into his jacket. "I don't know if I can do this," he said, voice low. "Not yet. I spent years wondering, hating even. I need time." "Take it," Jimmy said, pushing the box forward. "This is yours too. When you're ready, Samuel and Abigail, they want to meet you." Michael blinked, stunned. "They know? Now they do." He nodded slow, guarded but open. "Maybe. I'll think about it." Weeks passed, then a month. Michael didn't call, and Jimmy didn't push. Time was his to take. Then one evening, the phone rang. Samuel's voice, steady but warm. "He reached out, Dad. Wants to meet. Slow. Just us first." Samuel met him first, a quiet lunch a month later, then Abigail joined a week after. 2 months on, they gathered at the house, Jimmy, Samuel, Abigail, and Michael. The kitchen wasn't loud at first. Tentative words, awkward silences, but it grew. Samuel asked about Michael's work. Abigail shared stories of their mom, her laugh breaking the ice. Michael listened, answered short, then longer, a crack widening into something real. Jimmy watched from the doorway, the ache in his chest easing. They weren't whole. Too many years lost for that. But they were here, building something from the ashes Ellie had left. That night, Jimmy stood outside, the sky clear and studded with stars. He held Ellie's scarf, the blue one he'd found, against his cheek, feeling her in the fabric, in the house, in the voices inside. "We did it, Ellie," he whispered. "It's enough." The message settled deep, unshakable. Love isn't a perfect story. It's a choice, carved from flaws and forgiveness, strong enough to stand when everything else burns away. And as the wind carried his words into the night, Jimmy knew this house, scarred and steady, would hold them all.